Welcome back to an introduction to recovery residences. And in this video, we're going to take a historical perspective. So I've often wondered, where did recovery residences originate? How did they evolve? And so we can ask ourselves the question, how long have peers been living together and supporting each other in recovery? And so if you were to guess, would you think it's since the 1800s, since the 1900s, maybe since the 2000s? Well, thanks to historians like Bill White, who wrote Slaying the Dragon, The History of Addiction Treatment and Recovery in America, we can trace the early versions of recovery residences to the Washingtonians. They were a mutual aid society that rapidly rose within the temperance movement of the 1800s. They provided sober living environments as early as 1841. The Washingtonians established a home for the fallen in 1857 and the House of Boston in 1863. If I remember right, I read that they oftentimes referred to these as inebriate homes, which I think is funny given the language of today. This means that recovery residences are a 170-year peer-led legacy. So let's move on to the mid 1900s. So a century later, we see the rise of Alcoholics Anonymous, which was founded in 1935, and shortly afterwards, we started seeing the AA homes, AA farms, and AA retreats that were established. Some well-known 12-step recovery residences included Pioneer House and Hazel's Den, which later evolved into Hazelden and the Minnesota model of addiction treatment. So as you can see, recovery residences were the precursor to modern addiction treatment. Also in the mid-1900s, we see therapeutic communities emerge, and they continued to evolve into different models over the decades. And the mid-1900s also gave rise to what are called halfway houses. And the Association of Halfway House and Alcoholism Programs, or AHAP, was formed. And I'll ask you to make a bookmark on AHAP because we're going to talk about them again in a couple of slides. So on to the late 1900s, where research on recovery residences really helped define the social model, and social model homes and programs evolved. Oxford House, which is a franchise of democratically operated recovery residences, was founded in 1975, and that model has been replicated across the United States and also in other nations as well. And we also see that regional owners and operators started coming together and organizing, establishing quality standards, especially in Georgia and California. So giving a shout out to the California Association of Addiction and Recovery Resources, or CAR, which was founded in 1978. The Georgia Association of Recovery Residences was founded in 1987, and the Sober Living Network in 1996. So I think it's also important for us to acknowledge some of the policy turning points that really started helping the growth of recovery residences. So the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968 didn't directly impact recovery residences or housing for persons in recovery from substance use issues, but that really laid the foundation going forth. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 first started talking about substance use disorder as a disability. And then that brings us to really key legislation in 1988, the Fair Housing Amendments Act, which added disability to the protected classes under the Fair Housing Act. And persons in recovery from substance use issues meet that definition of disabled. And so this establishes individual and recovery's right to live in residential neighborhoods. And it's why we're able to see recovery residences really not restricted into to commercial zoning or into the counties. Really, it's individuals have the right to people who meet the definition of disabled, like individuals with substance use issues, have the right to housing choice. Moving on, in 1988, we see the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which allocated some funding to recovery housing, specifically to Oxford House. Most states have sunsetted that legislation or that mandate. There's a couple that continue to offer those revolving loan funds. And then there's also really key legislation, the American with Disabilities Act of 1990, and then the Olmstead decision, which was a part of the ADA of 1999. And so we're really touching just the very surface of all these key pieces of legislation. And I encourage you to do more research. But I thought it would be good to just give a very top level overview of the legislation that really helped recovery residences kind of, really advance and move forward the way that we see it today. So moving into the early 2000s, we start seeing this growing body of research on recovery residences. And, a big shout out to the researchers like Dr. Leonard Jason out of DePaul University, Doug Polson of the Alcohol Research Group, Amy Miracle, even George DeLeon when it came to therapeutic communities. There have been so many researchers that have contributed to this body of work. And as a result, we've started seeing some recovery residences listed on the National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices, specifically Oxford House, and then there's a couple of therapeutic community models that are listed as well. Other models of recovery residences have also been studied, but we need more research. Currently, you would consider them promising practices. And if we were able to increase the body of research on those particular models, then they would rise to the level of being considered evidence-based program and practice. So that gets us to 2011. And this is when we see the National Alliance for Recovery Residences form. NAR developed standards. They developed this inclusive framework that identifies best practices for the 4 levels of support, identified, the nomenclature that we use, the code of ethics, and really started formulating and formalizing how we talk about recovery residences today. I'll point out 2013 is when AHAP, remember I said earmark AHAP, so the Association of Halfway House and Alcoholic Programs, merged with NAR, the National Alliance for Recovery Residences. And so with that merger, the organization became both the oldest and largest recovery residence organization of its kind. So moving into further into the 2000s, we just see this growing national dialogue, and we're going to pick up this conversation in the next video. But for now, I hope that you enjoyed this historical perspective, give you a better understanding of where recovery residences have come from as a way of looking into the future. Thanks.